All right. So right now I am recording the class itself, so that way I can make sure to go ahead and upload that back to Blackboard. Um, okay, perfect. So you guys can see me, you guys can hear me, you guys can see the slides. We are good. Okay, so let's go here just pretty quickly here and talk a little bit about this idea of research methods and what research methods is all about. So when we look at the idea of research methods and what research methods is, um, there's always a big question about what's going to be covered. And also, if you all are interested with the slides are posted on Blackboard for you. So that way, if you go into the week 1 module, you don't actually have to worry about writing everything down from the slides or anything like that. I've already provided you with the lecture slides, so that way you can print them out or you can have them on your tablets and mark away and write your notes that way. Okay, so in terms of the course, right, everyone always asks, what is it that we're really going to be talking about in this course? So the obvious thing is always going to be, well, we're going to be talking about research, right? But more specifically, we're going to talk about how to create research designs. We're going to talk about how to actually take research studies upon ourselves and collect data, analyze the results, and interpret the results and try to understand what those results really mean for us. Not necessarily what is it that's going to be changing our field or anything like that, but okay, now the slides disappeared. Awesome. Okay. Can you all see the slides now? The slides should now have reappeared. Okay, perfect. I have no idea. Thanks, technology. Thank you. That's the last time I'll talk about technology for today. Okay, so in terms of research, what is it that we're going to be doing? Again, we're going to try to create, we're going to try to design, conduct research studies that are psychological in their nature, but most importantly, we're going to try to understand what they mean. We're going to try to look at this whole global idea and say to ourselves, okay, what is it that our results really mean for us? Not necessarily world changing or anything like that, but what do they mean in terms of the context of what it is that we've collected? So when you guys look at research and you guys are reading research articles, you have to understand that that research study that you are reading is not perfect. It is not the most perfectly done study. It is not the world-changing study that we might think it potentially might be, but rather it is just one small piece of the puzzle to the overarching larger puzzle of what we would call psychology, and even more specifically, your subdiscipline. So for instance, when I do research, I always have to think about it in terms of that the research study, no matter how good it is that I've done, no matter how large and how much data I've collected, and no matter how many participants have participated in my research study, this is just one small puzzle piece for the larger overarching idea of what bilingualism is in terms of language comprehension, right? So no one study is going to be perfect and it's going to answer every single question, but rather it's really going to give us this idea of it's going to answer some questions and it's going to leave us with more questions. So with doing research, this also makes us better evaluators and critics of other research studies. So from here on out, part of what we're going to be doing with the course, we're going to be learning how to identify specific issues related to limitations, strengths, and possible future research studies that we might want to be able to do ourselves or that other researchers might want to be able to do. Also, we want to try to apply any type of statistical analysis to research studies. Now, whenever it is that we talk about statistical analysis, everyone always jumps, everyone always freaks out. Oh, I don't want to talk about math, I don't want to talk about stats. I understand that, but here you have to understand that whenever it is that we talk about statistical analyses for research studies, we're literally not saying you have to take your statistics book and use all the statistical analyses that are there to answer your research questions and use them in your research studies. But rather, we're going to select the appropriate statistical analysis that fits our research design and answers our question. And I'm going to help you along that route too. And last, we're going to also talk about how to write research reports, right? Which is going to be a very important, integral part of our course. So a lot of people then ask themselves and ask me, well, is the course really going to be difficult? And the answer is, of course, yes and no. Why is it going to be difficult? Well, it's going to be difficult because there's a lot of material. It's 8 weeks. Research in itself should be a very lot longer in terms of time that we're really studying it, to be honest. I've been in the field of psychology now I don't know, I think something like 15, 16 years. And I'm still learning every single day about new research issues or new research designs or limitations, or how is it that we actually do better sampling from populations and so on and so forth. So it's never taken lightly in terms of what it is that we're learning, and we should never take lightly the amount of things that we're going to be doing in this class. Never think to yourself, oh, this is busy work, because it's really not. Every single thing that we're going to be doing this semester has an intended purpose to make you a better researcher, because that's my goal, to make you a better researcher. Even if you're saying to yourself, I want to be a researcher, I have no interest at all in being a researcher, that's okay. Inherently, we're all researchers because we've all done research at some point in time. Even if you think back, right, to whenever it was that you were in 6th grade and you did your first research project, right, you did your science fair project. I still remember mine. Mine was amazing. Mine was which paper towel was the most absorbent. And the answer, if you're really wanting to know, it's Bounty. And in my house, we still buy Bounty because I still abide by my research findings. Even though, just like a good researcher that I was at 6th grade, I waited till the very last moment, the night before I had to go present at the research fair, that I needed to do this research project and let my mom know that. So probably my results are probably not valid, but I'm still going to base my actual purchasing behaviors based on those results. So here, when we think about that, we all have been researchers. We all ask research questions. We all want answers to questions, even about simple things about human behavior. And we get asked questions all the time about human behavior because we are psychologists. Part of what that means is we have to understand the research. And even again, if you say to yourself, but I'm not a researcher, I don't want to ever do research, I'm not going to do it, you have to at some point. And why? You at least have to understand it. Because if you're going to be a therapist, if you're going to be a counselor, if you're going to be a researcher, if you're going to be a professor, if you're going to be a clinician, doesn't matter. You have to understand research because you have to understand how it is that we've selected the techniques that we're using for therapies, for instance, or why is it that we're selecting the techniques that we're using in educational settings to teach people this type of material. All of that is grounded in research, not in our own personal opinion, but rather research. So here, part of what I really recommend for you to do, because we do have a lot of things to do this semester, look at the weekly readings, do those weekly readings before you come to class. So for instance, beginning with the next day's class, right? Not necessarily tomorrow's class, but next week's class, make sure that you understand the content that you've read for chapter 1 and for chapter 3, and we're going to move forward in trying to understand what that content really means. So a lot of the things that I'm going to present in my lecture slides for you all are not necessarily straight out of the textbook. That would be a boring class. Rather, what I do is I take the book and I use it to supplement my lectures. Okay, so in other words, I've gathered my lectures and I've created my lectures based on all this other material that I've read over the years, all these other textbooks that I've read over the years about research methods and different types of methodologies, and use those to create my lectures. So here, the textbook is really going to be there to supplement my lectures. I'm not really there to supplement the textbook. All right. So once it is now that we've kind of gotten over these ideas of, oh, research might be hard, or I don't want to do research. You got to like research at some point. And if you don't like research, hopefully by the end of the semester, you at least have a smaller appreciation for research. We'll at least go with that. So here, that's my goal. I want you to be a good researcher. If you don't want to be a researcher, I at least want you to have an appreciation for research and understand its utility, and also understand how to interpret research findings from articles or textbooks. Okay, so where is it that we're really going to get started? We're going to get started with talking about the purpose of research. What is the major purpose of research? If you look at different theories related to the purpose of research, or different ideas related to the purpose of research, research is really the following, or it serves four purposes. Number one, it's really used to describe. What does it describe, or this aspect of description? The idea that we accurately portray the situation of the phenomenon. So in other words, today we know X about bilingualism and language comprehension. Tomorrow, that situation might change. So when I explain what it is that the situation is tomorrow, when it's tomorrow, so the next day I explain that, I base that explanation based on the research that we've been doing on the previous days. That's part of what the idea of doing research is, that we're describing the current situation of that phenomenon. Number two, we explain or have this aspect of explanation. So the statement of cause of some situation of the phenomenon. And this is always a big thing that we talk about a lot in research, the idea of cause. What is it that we want? What is it that we want to be able to say at the end of the day? And the idea is that we always want to say what causes what. So in other words, I study 10 hours, that causes me to get 100 on the exam. And you know the answer as well as I do, that's never guaranteed. And why? Because we realize that multiple factors may potentially affect our outcome. So in other words, it's not just studying 10 hours that give you 100%, but rather it's the studying of 10 hours, having attended every lecture, revisited the online lectures, read the textbook, done the quizzes, done the homeworks, etc., etc., etc. All of that led you to now potentially getting 100. Will it even be guaranteed if we did it again that you'll get 100? No, you might get a 99 next time, or a 99.5, or even a 98, but at least it shouldn't deviate too drastically from 100. Next, we look at the aspect of prediction, the ability for us to now anticipate the occurrence of some event in the future. The way I've always thought about this is the following. It's a weird example, but you just have to go with me, right? So let's say, for instance, that you have research participants that are coming into a research situation, and what you want to do is you want to predict your ability to decrease someone's self-esteem. So what do? Participant A walks in the room. There's a room's already filled with all these other people who are going to be your confederates, right? These people who are on your side, who are people who understand what your research project is all about. They're not real participants. So here comes research participant A. Participant comes in and we say, "Hi, Mary Sue," whatever your name may be. "We're really nice to meet you," and so on and so forth. "We're going to ask you to complete this survey." Now, Mary Sue, unfortunately, I don't really mean this in an awkward way or anything, but it kind of smells like you haven't really showered in a couple of days. I'm really sorry. And Mary Sue gets all freaked out. Oh my God. So you go, "Okay, so what we're going to ask you to do, Mary Sue, is going to go sit over there in the very far end of the room to the back, all by yourself over there. Would you mind doing that?" So now there goes Mary Sue, poor thing, right? And here we're even playing on the assumption that she's even stayed in the research situation, right? Because a normal person would have been like, "I'm out of here," right? But here, poor Mary Sue's sticking with it. So she's all the way out there in the back. And now she's filling out some of the surveys and so on and so forth. And you go up to her and you go, "Mary Sue, I'm really sorry, but some of the other participants are kind of complaining about your hygiene. I'm really, really sorry. Could we ask you to maybe now finish the research study and finish those surveys outside?" So now we move poor Mary Sue outside. And here Mary Sue, she's still being a good sport about it apparently. And she goes, "Fine." And she'll go, she sits outside by herself. And now what do? We look at her questionnaire related to self-esteem. And based on my manipulation, the way that I've treated Mary Sue in this particular case, I would expect that her self-esteem level should be what? High or low? And you're all thinking to yourself, it should be low. And you're 100% correct. That's what I would predict to happen. Is that guaranteed? No. Here, I hope that's going to happen and that my manipulation is effective in being able to create that effect in terms of her behavior, but there's no guarantee of it. So potentially poor Mary Sue might come back into the room and say, "It doesn't matter. That's the way I like it." And she gives you the survey and walks out. And you're like, "Damn, Mary Sue, like you have like an amazing level of self-esteem that like I've never seen before." Because if anybody ever said that about me, right, that they said, "Hey, it smells like if you haven't showered in a couple of days," I would freak out, right? And I would run home and take a shower. That's the idea of prediction. Last, the idea of control, right? The purpose of control. And how is it that we actually can control other factors that are out there? In other words, the ideas of extraneous variables, the ideas of confounds, or what we also call third variables. In other words, when you study for 10 hours, what happens to your exam performance? We hope that only the 10 hours of studying is the only factor that we assume here is affecting your exam performance. If other potential factors that are not in our control are affecting that particular issue right there of our 10 hours in our exam performance may change drastically for the person having studied for 10 hours. Yeah, they studied for 10 hours, but they didn't sleep for 48 hours. Versus person B, they studied for 10 hours and slept 8 hours. Well, of course the scores are going to be different. That's the aspect of control, manipulating all the other possible factors that we possibly can, so that way we can try to establish definitive causality as best as we can. That A, the 10 hours of sleeping, really does cause B, our exam performance. The term that we also use for this idea of control, we call this aspect error variance, right? This idea of internal validity. Internal validity is the high degree of control that we have in a research situation. So I'll say it again. Internal validity, the high degree of control that we have in a research situation. Why are we trying to do this? Because we're trying to control what we would call error variance, ERROR variance. So again, error variance, ERROR variance. So with a high degree of internal validity, so in other words, manipulating and controlling as many possible factors that I can in my research situation, that should hopefully lead me to having less error variance. What is error variance, or how is it defined? It is defined as differences in our scores that are not due to the researcher's manipulation or control. So I'll say that again. Differences in our scores that are not due to the researcher's manipulation or control. That's error variance. Two very, very important terms that we're going to talk about probably another 1,000 times before the end of our 8 weeks. Every single class session, about every other paragraph that I talk about here, or every other conversation that I'll have, is going to be about error variance and internal validity, because these are things that constantly are coming back up in every single research situation. So again, going back to being a good critic of research papers and research projects is looking at that aspect. What are possible limitations that might potentially have existed in a research situation? In other words, how can we identify possible error variance in our research situation that might have led me to have differences in my scores that were not due to the researcher's manipulation or control? So in other words, my grade is not 100, but rather it's an 80, but I studied 10 hours. My friend also studied 10 hours. They got 100. How did we differ? Well, your friend slept 8 hours. You haven't slept in 48 hours. That difference is error variance. That's not something that was manipulated to account for the differences in our scores. Questions, concerns up to now? If you have any questions, please text me. If you don't, we will continue on. All right, so the next thing here that we'll look at is this idea of the progression of science, right? This idea of how do we actually move forward in our scientific discipline? Because you have to remember that psychology is a scientific discipline. In other words, we follow this idea of having a systematic empiricism. We have this idea of following the scientific method, right? And we all know that if we follow the scientific method, then we're considered to be a scientific discipline. Again, going back to our 6th grade or 5th grade science fair projects, they taught us all about the scientific method and what the scientific method was all about. And they told us that there were 3 parts of the scientific method. Number 1, systematic empiricism. Number 2, examination of a solvable problem. And number 3, dissemination of knowledge to the scientific community. If you have those 3 factors, or if you have those 3 criteria, then you can claim that you're doing scientific research and you're following the scientific method. So here, we in psychology do the exact same thing, thus we are a science. Since we are a science, it's important for us to understand how we follow along in terms of doing research as a scientific discipline. The first thing that we need to be able to do, or the first step, is what we would say is that we identify that the effect even exists out there in nature. So one of the things that I always like to think about in terms of an effect that can exist is this idea of the evil eye, right? You all know the evil eye, mal de ojo, right? Ojo, you all know it. With the idea of the evil eye, right? People always say that it exists. Now, I'm not here to tell you that it doesn't exist, so if you believe in the evil eye, that's completely up to you. But in terms of scientific research, in terms of us being able to say, we can actually observe that the effect actually exists. So for instance, you looking at somebody else and going, oh, look, I can see those 2 people and one of them is giving the evil eye to the other one. I could see it being transmitted between those 2 people. No, we really can't do that, right? And if you can see that, that's amazing, to be honest with you. And I need to bring you to my house to make sure that nobody's doing it over here. But with the idea of the evil eye is, we don't really even know if it exists. But people tell us it exists all the time, right? A baby continues to cry and nothing takes away the crying from the baby, right? You give the baby medication, fed it, changed it, bathed it, you've done all these things. Baby's still crying, evil eye. You got to wipe them down with the egg, wipe them down with the little brush and so on and so forth. And now we're going to be good. And we're going to say to ourselves, okay, we've gotten rid of the evil eye. Is there really any evidence that that is actually even existing? And the answer is no. Since we don't have that ability to identify if it does exist or not, we can't really study it from a scientific perspective. All right. Number two, identifying what we would call moderators. What are moderators? Moderators tell us when, where, and for whom the effect occurred. So in other words, when I study for 10 hours versus when I study for 5 hours, my grade is higher when I study for 10 hours than when I study for 5 hours. Okay, so again, moderators. What do they tell us? When, where, and for whom the effect occurs. Number three, we identify mediators. What do mediators tell us? Mediators tell us the why. So in other words, why is it that when you study 10 hours versus when you study 5 hours, you perform better on the exam? So here the answer may be, well, because when you study for 10 hours, you retain more information and you've been able to process more information at that point in time. Thus, you're much more likely to recall more information during the exam. So again, mediators tell us why. Last, the idea of us trying to establish definitive causality. Very, very important for us trying to establish this idea of definitive causality. So in other words, definitively me stating that A does truly cause B, right? So in other words, you studying 10 hours versus you studying 5 hours actually leads you to getting a better score on your exam than when you study for 5 hours, right? That's the idea. For us, step number 4 here, establishing definitive causality, is what we would call the holy grail for us in terms of research. So in other words, it's the elusive holy grail. We're always in search of definitive causality. Now, with that being said, we got to be careful with the term cause, because like I just said, it's the elusive holy grail. What do we all know about the story of the holy grail, right? So if you look at Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade and all those other stories of the holy grail, the Da Vinci Code, people never find the holy grail. And when they find it, it's always these different things or what we expect them to have been or whatever the case may have been. For us in research, especially psychological research, it's elusive to us. It's very hard for us to pinpoint that one thing really does cause another for us. It's like saying, I bought a puzzle and the puzzle only came with one piece. And then I put the puzzle down, I put the piece down, and I've made the puzzle. We know that that's not true, but rather, what is a psychological phenomenon? A psychological phenomenon is like one of those puzzles that comes with like 1 billion puzzle pieces and they're all a little tiny and they're all the same color and you're like, oh, I don't even know where to start. That's exactly what psychological phenomena are like. It's very complex, very, very complicated, and each one of our research studies functions like a little puzzle piece. So we begin with one research study, one puzzle piece. A next research study, the second one. And we start putting them together until it starts making a better understanding of the whole. Questions, concerns up to now? If you have questions, concerns, please feel free to text me. Last here of what we'll talk about, this idea of gaining knowledge. With research, the whole purpose of research is for us to gain knowledge. That's really what the whole purpose is. What kind of knowledge are we going to gain? I really don't know. Is it going to be a good outcome or a bad outcome? I really don't know, to be honest with you. I've actually heard some people critique researchers, especially in psychology, about what's the purpose of us doing research. So why is it that we do research about prejudice? Or why is it that we do research about differences between, people who learn a language early on versus a language later on? What's the purpose of it? What good are you doing in the world? That's what somebody once said. And I thought to myself, wow, that's an interesting question. What good am I doing? And I thought to myself, well, as a researcher, it's really not about doing good or bad, but rather, again, I'm going back to this point here. I'm just trying to tell you how things are. That's all I'm trying to explain to you. So in other words, why is it that couples fight? Well, that's a difficult question to answer, but yet we're trying to understand it as best as we possibly can. So in other words, it's not because of us doing research that we're now going to solve how to stop people from fighting, but rather we're just trying to understand that current situation. Now, the purpose, your specific purpose, is to get them to stop fighting, and you're trying to develop techniques to be able to do that. That's fine too. But is that really going to be something good? I really don't know. What if the couple just really likes to fight and that's the way they like to do things and they enjoy arguing because it leads to better and bigger things later on? I can't really stop them from doing that. I can't say the fighting is bad. That's up to them and their perception of what is good and what is bad. So here when we look at research, is it really my job or your job to create good in this world by me doing this specific type of research? The answer is no. Am I doing bad? No, because I'm just telling you how things are. So, is there still prejudice that exists out in our world? Yes. Is there still discrimination that exists out in the world? Yes. Is there still poverty in our world? Yes. Is there still gender discrimination in our world? Yes. Just because it exists doesn't mean that I shouldn't look at it and tell you what the current situation is, or even me trying to stop it. That may be for somebody else to do, but rather I'm just trying to tell you how things currently are. So the best way that I really kind of understood this is actually by an author by the name of Wolf. He wrote, I believe his name is Jeremy Wolf, if I'm not mistaken. He wrote this book, The Viral Storm. The book is not that great, and I'm sorry if Jeremy Wolf is listening to my lecture, but your book was not that great, unfortunately. But the book actually had one really awesome quote, or one really awesome kind of statement. And this was the statement that I got from it, and I always put it now on all my research methods and statistics courses. He said, the objective of science or research is not to uncover the things that make us uncomfortable, but rather the things as they are. So in other words, just because things make us uncomfortable from time to time doesn't mean that we shouldn't research them, doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about them, but rather we should talk about them. And we should talk about what the current situation is. And we need to talk about them because it's important for us to understand what this really means for us. Questions, concerns up to now? If you have questions, please feel free to text me. All right. So the next thing here then that we need to talk about is this idea of how do we actually obtain knowledge, right? How do we actually gain this knowledge? And there's a couple of different ways that we can actually gain knowledge. Number one, we can gain knowledge through what we would call tradition. Tradition is just a way of us accepting knowledge because everyone else has always thought about it in this particular way. So again, here thinking about the evil eye, right? So people have always talked to you about the evil eye, and the evil eye exists, and this is how the evil eye works, and this is how the evil eye is cured, and so on and so forth. Well then, if you accept that, you are gaining that knowledge based on tradition, not on actually any type of authority or any type of research situation, but rather you're just basing that on tradition. The second way that we gain knowledge is through what we would call intuition. So we would acquire knowledge on the basis of feeling, instinct, or inspiration. These are things that people always say, it's my gut feeling. Someone in my family always talks about that. I can feel it that this is going to happen. I'm like, what? What are you talking about? Like they buy scratch-off tickets, and they always talk about this. I feel that I'm gonna win the Mega Millions, and I'm like, with a scratch-off ticket, really? Like this is what you're banking on here, and you spent $1 on it? Like really? The probabilities are really, really low. I can feel it. You have to have faith. You have to trust that this is going to happen. No, that's probably not going to happen. And when they don't win, they go, it's because your bad vibes didn't let me win. So I get blamed for them having lost because of a pre-printed scratch-off ticket, right? And of course, we all do that. And to be honest, I like buying scratch-off tickets too. I think they're fun. And then I always blame other people that I go, oh, you picked the wrong one for me, right? My wife will sometimes go to the gas station and she'll pick $1 one because I'll tell her, buy a scratch-off ticket. She'll come back and I'll lose and I'll be like, oh, I didn't even get a winning one. And I go, I should have gone. I would have been lucky enough that I would have grabbed it. And the magic numbers, right, that were already pre-printed on this ticket would have magically now changed. So that's one way that we can actually acquire also knowledge, right? Through this aspect of intuition, that we just feel it, right? So here, think of the aspect also of superstition. This is a very important thing, right? So let's say, for instance, you always flip your hat up, inside out to help your team rally, and your team wins. You've gained knowledge, and you've said to yourself, well, when my team is down, the next time they're down, I'm going to flip my hat inside out, and I'm going to put it on, and that's going to help them win. No, it's not. Your magical hat isn't going to do anything, but yet we feel that it may, right? And last, the aspect of authority. Where do we also gain knowledge from? From authority figures. Who are authority figures? If you think about it from the research realm, it would be researchers. These are the authority figures, people who are educated, people who are knowledgeable of the topic, and they're working every single day in it. They're highly credible sources. So thus, we get the knowledge from them. Also, think of, for instance, news outlets, right? That you may say to yourself, well, that's a credible news outlet versus a non-credible news outlet. I'm going to take that credible news outlet's information and I'm going to believe in it and that's how I'm going to gain knowledge versus this other source, right? So as scientists, which one would we base ourselves on and why? And the answer is actually all three. It's really not one or the other. Now, to be honest, much more scientific approaches, we would want to base ourselves off of authority. But you have to think about yourself, work backwards now. What happens to the person who first studied that particular topic from a scientific perspective? Where did they get the knowledge from previously? More than likely, they got it from intuition or they got it from tradition. So take myself for example. Growing up, I grew up in Mexico. I grew up in northern Mexico. So here in the valley, we have a city called Brownsville. It's the southernmost tip of Texas. On the Mexican side of the border is Matamoros. That's where I grew up. I was born here in the U.S. and I grew up my entire life over there. And then when I got older, I was in my early 20s, I moved over here to the U.S. and I went to graduate school in Kansas and all these things. But my parents still live in Mexico and everything like that, and I still go over there quite frequently. So growing up in Mexico, growing up especially in Matamoros, we were always very prejudiced towards individuals who spoke two languages at the same time. We actually call it code switching in scientific and psychological terms. That's the actual term that we use, code switching. It's actually a very normal thing. So when you take two language systems that are in close contact with each other culturally and physically, people will code switch. So in other words, they will take words from one language and they will adapt them to their language and they will use those systems interchangeably. It's like saying, man, I'm really hungry, quiero un pacón ahorita, you know? That's the kind of thing that we're talking about, the idea of code switching. Growing up on the Mexican side of the border, we always frowned upon the idea of people who code switch. To us, that was a very negative thing. We had a lot of negative ideas about it. Well, people who code switch, they're not well educated enough to actually manage both of their systems. They're not smart enough. They have low socioeconomic status, etc., etc., etc. Those kinds of ideas, those kind of prejudicial views are passed down in terms of tradition, right? There's no scientific basis for them or anything like that. People just tell one thing to another, and that's how prejudice kind of continues on down the line. So the idea of gaining that through tradition. Somebody may have actually gained that knowledge initially through intuition, that they may have said to themselves, oh, I just think that. Okay, fine. An instinct or an inspiration or a feeling, and that's the conclusion that they drew about that knowledge, and then they pass it on to the next generation or to the next individuals and so on and so forth. So growing up in Mexico, that's what we always thought. We always thought that. It was a very normal thing. So when I go off to graduate school in Kansas, and I'm up there doing my graduate work, I get interested in the idea of bilingualism. And I want to do research on code switching because I got these negative ideas about it's so bad, people shouldn't do it, blah, blah, blah. Again, I'm basing myself off tradition. I have no knowledge of this at all. So what ends up happening? I do research, and what do I find? Man, people who code switch are actually really, really good at a cognitive level. They're actually better cognitively and more efficient cognitively than people who are just bilingual, who separate their two languages out and don't code switch. Totally the opposite of what's always been told to us. So in other words, people who code switch are actually better at being able to store information, at accessing information, and being able to do parallel tasks more efficiently because they're already working with two systems. It's like juggling, and they juggle all the time, and they got really good at it, versus someone who's a bilingual, like myself growing up in Mexico, where I learned English and Spanish as two separate language systems and we weren't allowed to mix them, so they're completely separate from each other. Here, I'm trying to juggle by throwing one ball up, and then I throw the other ball up. Yeah, I might be able to juggle, but I'm not that good at it. So here that blows my entire perspective away of it's being bad, and it's not. And I've actually done tons of research on it, and those prejudicial ideas of mine that I used to have back 15, 20 years ago no longer exist because I have scientific evidence that tells me that was wrong. So here, the idea of how we gain knowledge is not cemented in us permanently just because we've gained the knowledge, but rather it's fluid. And that's the idea of research, that we need to be able to base ourselves off on the aspects of authority, but our initial ideas come from intuition or even tradition. And then we work our way to doing it in a scientific perspective and studying it scientifically, and thus now we're able to move forward and being able to be the experts and being those credible sources. All right. Questions, concerns up to now. If you have questions, concerns, feel free to email me. Or text me. All right, this is what I'm going to do. Since we had a lot of technical difficulties and everything like that, I do apologize for that. I'm going to go ahead and stop here. We'll stop about 15 minutes early. I'll go ahead and stop here. I'll record the remainder of the lecture and post this on Blackboard for you all a little bit later on, so that way you guys can have access to that lecture and make sure that you all are able to continue on with listening to some of the things that I needed to talk about. Now, when we come back next week, we'll go through and we'll wrap up talking about the remaining issues here that we've got, because there are some very important issues that we need to talk about. But before I let you all go, one very, very quick thing that I do want you all to look at here, and give me 1 second here. Let me just make sure that I am screen sharing the appropriate thing. Okay, give me 1 second here. Okay. Give me 1 second. I do want to talk to you all a little bit about your mini assignment and what your mini assignment is all about. So before you all go, and just to make sure y'all can still hear me, y'all can still see my screen, correct? If you can, somebody text me, please. Okay, perfect. Okay, so if you all go to weekly modules in Blackboard and go to week 1, Introduction to Course, you'll notice here that there's a mini assignment that I have for you. So for your mini assignment, it's due on June 8th, right? So this Friday, and pretty much this is what I want you to answer. I want you to answer the following 3 questions here that are posed for you. Number 1, what is your research topic that you would like to do research on this semester? Number 2, is there enough peer-reviewed literature to prepare a brief literature review for the semester? And number 3, would you be comfortable continuing this line of research for the remainder of your professional career? Those are 3 very, very important questions. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, okay, the first 2 I'm totally with you, and then the third one just kind of comes out of left field. And the answer is yes. And the reason for that is, if you're not comfortable wanting to do this kind of research for the remainder of your career, it's not even something that's going to be enjoyable for 8 weeks. I'm going to guarantee you that. You're going to look at this as being a tedious task. It's going to look like an annoyance, and all that you're going to want to do is get this done and over with. So rather, pick a topic, whatever topic it is that you want to do research on this semester. It can be anything that you want. It can be what are the effects of code switching on memory performance? Go for it. We could totally do something along those lines. Don't worry about ethics. Don't worry about IRB or anything like that. I want you to use your imagination. What's of interest to you? What brought you into psychology and to your specific subfield that you're interested in to being able to work? This is going to be the formation of your idea for your research proposals. Now, once it is a give me your ideas, I'll start refining it and I'll give you feedback, so that way you now have a clear question and a clear direction of where you need to go for your research paper. Questions, concerns up to now? If you do, please feel free to text me. Now, with your assignment, all you have to do is you have to come up with 2 research ideas, 2 of them, not just 1, 2 of them, and answer these 3 questions. If you can answer those 3 questions, and the reason I ask you for 2 of them is from those 2, I can pick 1, or I can mold them together and refine them into 1. All right. Again, this is due by June 8th, Friday, by 11:59 p.m. All right. And the way that you're going to submit them, write it in a Word document, and you're going to submit here your submission to me. You can click on Browse My Computer and you'll be able to attach your file, or you can write out your submission as well and being able to submit your responses that way. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and finish off for today here. And if you guys have any questions or concerns, then I promise that we will get this technology stuff figured out for next week. I promise. All right, guys, have a good rest of your day, and I will see you all next Monday.